everyone. We're going to get started. I'd like to welcome you all to the Ireland Lecture Series. This is a program of the Institute of Island Studies, and this lecture series has been running on and off since the 1980s, so that's pretty cool. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land we're gathered on is the traditional and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq, who have lived here for over 12,000 years. And I'd like to express my gratitude to the elders past, present, and future for their stewardship and for their keeping of culture. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Fran Simmers. I'm the managing editor of Island Studies Press, the publishing arm of the Institute of Island Studies. And the Institute is a research, education, and public policy institute, and we're based just down the hall. You can learn more about what we do by checking our social media accounts or going onto our website, islandstudies.com, pretty easy to remember. And we also have a monthly newsletter. That's what this fabulous board in my hands is about. And it's voluntary. If you feel like signing up, if you love islands, you want to know everything about islands in the world, islands, things that are happening here, you can put your name and email down, and it doesn't go anywhere except for into my computer and then into the newsletter. So I'll pass that around, and you can have fun. We got that made especially for us. It's a lovely gift. So tonight the Island Lecture Series presents a talk by Frank Gillan called Finding Place, an Irish Story. And Frank's going to share a personal story with us about one Irish family's search for security, the challenges they face, and the resourcefulness and resilience of the women in particular to keep their family together. And I want to just make a note, if you haven't seen Frank's book or you don't have a copy, Frank does have a few copies here for sale. He does accept e-transfer, but he wants to direct you towards Kathy after the talk. She's in the front row. Frank Gillan, for those of you who don't know Frank, is there anyone here who doesn't know Frank? Show of hands. I just met him today. Okay. He's a sixth-generation Irish-Canadian, and in 2022 he published The Gillan Journey, County Antrim to Peaks Road, and in 2025 he published his mother's family story, They Can't Take the Kids, The Mooney McCarthy Gillan Legacy. Frank and his wife Kathy are retired and live in Charlottetown, so please welcome Frank.
Thank you. I'm going to change the game plan already. I'm going to talk about more than one Irish family, but they're my family. I chose as a topic Finding Place, an Irish Story, because my ancestors left Ireland, both on my maternal and paternal, for security. And they found it on Prince Edward Island. And that's really what that's about. And as far as my mother then and my grandmother, who's going to be the latter part of the presentation, they had to refine their security because their husbands died when they were quite young. So security was a central theme. And I'm sure if you have Irish roots, you're going to find that you hopefully could translate a lot of what I'm saying about my family, which will apply to yours. That, by the way, is sort of a replica of the ship that the Gillans came on in 1830, the Corsair. And I suspect most of the Irish immigrants would have arrived in a ship similar to that. My first book was The Gillan Journey, and that, as it would suggest, was my Gillan family. And the title of The Gillan Journey comes because, as you'll see, from the first generation through to the fourth, they all lived in a different place, which is really different because when we think of Prince Edward Island and our Irish ancestors, we think of community and passing the farm on one to the other. That didn't happen with all of those four generations, and in fact it didn't happen with the fifth either. Some of the land in the fourth generation stayed in the Gillan family, but none of the houses they lived in exist. So the sons all moved out to somewhere else in the community, and of course the role of the daughters was to find somebody to marry in the community. So that's why it was called the Gillan Journey. You'll find that in most families, the names repeat something terrible. And it's really hard to keep it straight. I had like 3 Jameses and 4 Bernards, and I think my ancestors always married a Mary, and it's just really, really difficult. But if you're doing research and you're having trouble with the names, sometimes you'll go back so many generations and you get stuck, and you don't know, especially in Ireland in the early 1800s, there were very few records. And sometimes you can use that to figure out, well, their names were probably that, and they followed that. Now, they followed that up until the late 1800s, and then it started to break down. But in the early 1800s and before, you can really depend on that as a naming pattern. My first book, I didn't have anything to go on, historic-wise. I had to do all of research. My second book, They Can't Take the Kids, I had a wealth of information. I interviewed my mother. I had a 10-hour interview with her, Marion McCarthy Gillan, in 1990, and she was a storyteller. And she lived in an intergenerational home in Morel, and so stories about her grandparents and just wonderful stories there, and of course her own life. But a real discovery that the Mooney family helped me with was Michael Mooney's papers. In 1932, when Michael Mooney was 80 years old, he decided that he was going to put to paper all the stories his father told him about living in arriving at PEI and clearing a pioneer farm and everything that came with it. He would have been one of the children living on that pioneer farm. So both his father and his grandfather came over from Ireland, and so Michael Mooney papers were just, it's like anybody who's done research, it's just a godsend. Because with the Gillans, I had nothing. Most of my Gillan ancestors were illiterate, probably the same as a lot, probably 60 to 70% of Irish immigrants were illiterate. So, and the churches didn't exist in Ireland legally, so you don't have church records. So I just had to find everything and piece it together. But this book, I just had a treasure trove of information. So, so this is going to be the thrust of my talk tonight, and I'm going to venture onto the Gillans briefly. So, the question I ask the most is, why in the name of God you do this? And it's a really good question. And I think that the best answer to the question is found in the prologue of my book. So I just want to go over that, and that'll also set up what I'm going to be talking about tonight. So this is the prologue to They Can't Take the Kids. At a private airstrip near Johnson's River, PEI, sheer terror swept over the woman who, with her 5 young children, was witnessing her husband's small plane fall from the sky, crashing to the ground a few hundred feet from her. The plane became engulfed in flames as men rushed to the scene and managed to pull out the 2 bodies. That woman was my mother, Marion McCarthy Gillan. The pilot was my father, Joseph B. Gillan. It was May 17, 1953, a sunny Sunday afternoon, when our world was torn apart and our family forever changed. I was one of those young children who was there with my mother. At age 4, I was aware of the catastrophic events surrounding me, the chaos, but thankfully have only a few images of the details. My 3 older siblings, aged 6, 9, and 11, were not so fortunate. The 2 older ones had been playing in the area of the crash site, rushed to it, and witnessed firsthand the gruesome events unfolding. My younger brother was only 4 months, a fortunate time to be an infant, unaware of the chaos around him. We older children had each been up for a plane ride with Dad, and it was next our mother's turn. But Mom declined in order to stay with the baby. A young man who loved airplanes and hang out at the airstrip, maybe hoping to snare some free rides, replaced my mother for that last fateful trip. After struggling through several mind-numbing days of the wake and funeral, the responsibility fell to our distraught mother to somehow pick up the pieces and carry on. to somehow find the strength to parent and comfort her 5 fatherless children, to somehow manage a household that no longer had the sole breadwinner in the family at a time that preceded financial assistance. Although Marion received tremendous emotional support, encouragement, and awe from the deep McCarthy Gillan family pulls, the challenge she faced required more. It required inner strength, perseverance, courage, unwavering resolve, and self-confidence. Qualities that are bred in the bone, and qualities that she must have both learned and inherited. When Marion Gillan was only 8 years old, her father had died, leaving her mother, Jennie McCarthy, with 4 young children and a large farming operation. Young Marion witnessed her mother keeping the family together, the farm operating, and being a wonderful mom. Thus, in the 1920s, a mother unwittingly helped her daughter to face the events of May 17, 1953, some 30 years later. Both women descended from a line of exceptional Mooney McCarthy men and women who demonstrated remarkable skills of risk-taking, courage, leadership, and kindness. Qualities they passed down through the generations to the matriarchs, first to Jennie Mooney McCarthy, and then to her daughter, Marion McCarthy Gillan, who watched in horror as her husband's plane crashed to the ground. Their story begins in Ireland. So that's how I sort of came about this. I had thought when I was a younger guy that Mom's story, it was such a horrific incident, should be told, but I just didn't have context for it. Then when I did my Gillan book, and I found out about my wonderful Gillan Irish ancestors, they were so brave that maybe I could wrap that around my mother's story and, of course, my grandmother's story, and then I just discovering all these wonderful people that I just had to write about. And that's how the book developed. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. Karen, where's Karen? Karen Mayer is with me. Karen is going to be my mother's voice for a couple of reasons. Some of it's pretty raw for me still, and it's good to have someone else read it. And so Karen will be joining me as we go through this. So that's my mom's line, and this is her yardstick. Some of you may have seen this before. Some of you may have felt it before. It has R.T. Holman on one side, and it's been around. It came from Queen Square, and I like to roam. I have to go back and hit this thing every then, so it's sort of keeping me corralled. But I'm only going to use it for pointing, I promise. So this is Mom down here, and her brothers, and I know there's some Morel people here will know the McCarthy siblings of Mom's. So you got Mom, her mother Jennie Mooney, and her grandmother Jane O'Halloran and Mary Sinnott. We're just a wonderful, wonderful source for her, and I think that's where the strength came from. These people up here, they all came from Ireland, and they took with them their children. And we're going to get into that a little bit more later. This guy here was my Mooney superhero. I mean, he was. When I did the Gillan research, I went into the newspapers, and they weren't even in jail, for God's sakes. I couldn't find anything in the newspapers. I did a Mooney search, and Andrew Mooney was everywhere. He lived east of Surrey, and he was just an ordinary guy who did extraordinary things. And you can sort of see where when you add it all together, where they got the strength. But these people, I mean, they're the brave people, and leaving Ireland, and I want to talk about that a bit. So, Antrim and Carlow and Limerick are where the parts of Ireland where my ancestors are from. It's interesting, the Gillans came from northern Antrim, and the Mooneys came from Antrim town, which is just sort of around the lake there. And Carlow was my O'Neill ancestors, and Limerick my McCarthy ancestors. The interesting thing about Prince Edward Island is that every county in Ireland is represented in Prince Edward Island. Every county. So why did they leave? Well, British oppression. I'm going to talk about each one of these. The penal laws, their faith threatened, the failure of the 1798 rebellion. Of course, they didn't own their own land. But you know, it all really boils down to the last one, to provide opportunity for their children. And that, you see that through the generations. And of course, we're the beneficiaries of all of that. When it came to land ownership in Ireland, these are sort of scary numbers. In 1641, Catholics owned 59% of the land. In 1703, it had fallen to 14%. 1800, 5%. Now this is when, if you have Irish ancestry like mine, this is when our ancestors probably started thinking about leaving. They were children in 1800, and they just saw no future. But those are telling numbers. And of course, we're going to find out when you got to Prince Edward Island, they couldn't own the land there either. The penal laws were in existence for about 200 years in Ireland. Catholics weren't permitted to vote, hold public office, own land, practice their religion, no churches, priests permitted. We're allowed to be educated. And this, when we chuckle at this last one, but it's really important, they couldn't own a horse worth more than 5 pounds. That means they could own an egg. They couldn't own a horse worth any value. And when you're talking about this time in history, if a horse was not only a method of transportation, it was a method of survival too, and earning a living and whatnot. So that was huge. And they could escape all of that by joining the Church of Ireland. And of course, most of them refused. And by the way, the penal laws also existed in PEI. By the time our Irish ancestors were getting here, when you get into the 1800s, the penal laws are being relaxed a bit, and they were eventually done away with. And I think around 1830, 1832, something like that, Catholics in Ireland got the right to vote, and also in Prince Edward Island. But Prince Edward Island was meant to be a Protestant colony, and we'll just talk about that a little bit later on. So, and they were required to, even though they didn't belong to the Church of Ireland, they were required to pay a tithe to the Church of Ireland. So the tax collector from the church would arrive at their house once a year, and if they didn't have any money, of course a lot of them didn't, they would just take 10% of their assets. And they still refused to join the Church of Ireland or anything to do with it. And in the Mooney papers, when I did the Gillan book, you know, you read the general history of Ireland, and the penal laws and all of those things are there. When I read the Mooney papers, they talked about the tithe and how much they hated that. And this was my surprise. The Moonies Michael Mooney pointed out that the 1798 rebellion was really a turning point for their family in leaving Ireland. The 1798 rebellion was influenced by the American-French revolutions. It was countrywide. And like all things with Irish rebellions, it failed. Mainly because they had traitors in their own midst and they just couldn't keep the whole thing quiet. And of course, the British troops came in with guns and they had pitchforks, so that didn't help either. And not only did it fail, but then there was the Act of Union in 1801. And if you all remember your British history or whatever, it sort of takes a different slant when I looked at it from my perspective this way. The Act of Union in 1801 dissolved the Irish legislature and set up the United Kingdom with England, Scotland, and Ireland was created. The Irish knew then that they were in a real pickle. Not only did they have a failed rebellion, they lost their legislature, they lost their parliament. This is the beginning of home rule. It's going to be 110 years or 20 years before they got it, but they were persistent. And they get home rule in 1920, and then they got complete independence in 1949. I take great pleasure in that because the Republic of Ireland me entered the world at the same time. Where they went? Well, up there at the top, you have 1821, the Mooney family of 11. They left the Greenville Road in Antrim, and they went to Antigonish, Nova Scotia. And they had a son, Daniel, who was 15. And I highlight that because you need to remember his name. And in 1827, the O'Neill family of 9 left County Carlow for Antigonish, and they had a daughter, Bridget. You can sort of see where this is going, I think. And she was 12. Daniel and Bridget married in Antigonish in 1835, make their way eventually to East Point and then to the Greenville Road in 1845. The interesting thing is, you got 1190, you got 20 in those two families. There's only 2 of them made it to PEI. So if you're a Mooney, from your history of the Peaks area, chances you're not related to this group in Eastern Kings at all, probably, unless it's back in Ireland, but it's certainly not in PEI, because they're the only 2 that arrived in PEI. By the way, those families of 11 and 9, it was a parent, father, a mother, father, and 9 kids, and a mother, father, and 7 kids, and the parents were in their 50s. Now that's, imagine the 50s in the 1820s, and you have the audacity to say I'm going, and you know, on a voyage that's risky, to a place that, God, where the hell are we going? You know, a wilderness. That takes a lot of guts. So, just to go ahead a little bit, this is me in search of the Greenville Road in Ireland. By God, I found it in County Antrim. A bit of a housing development there. You can't see it, but the small print above there says Borough of Antrim. And so that was pretty neat. Now, this is County Carlow. Same trip. Kathy and I a friend took us up to the top of Carstairs Mountain, and I'm looking down at County Carlow, and they caught me in a moment. I'm looking there thinking, imagine having to leave this beautiful, beautiful land. And my friend snapped a photo. But that's County Carlow that the O'Neills left. So the McCarthy family, they arrived on PEI in the 1820s from County Limerick, and they were in Cove Head. And in about 1850, the second generation went to Morel Rear. Now that took a little bit of bravery too, because they would have been on a pioneer farm clearing a wilderness when they arrived in Cove Head, and then the next generation said, we're going to Morel Rear, and there was less there. It was a wilderness, and they opened it up. But of course, what was the big attraction in Morel Rear? They could buy their land. Lots 38 and 39, and we're going to see that theme in both my Gillan side and my McCarthy side. The Gillans, if I could just leave that book and get back to the Gillans for a minute, they had a little bit tougher road. They're from the Ballycastle area, actually the village of Ermoy, so 4 miles south of Ballycastle. And they, with their 3 kids, decided they're going to walk to Glasgow to work in the mills. That's how desperate things were. So they took a ferry from Ballycastle over to the Mull of Kintyre in southern Scotland, walked with their 3 little kids, probably grabbed a ferry here somewhere, and then walked the rest of the way to Glasgow. And they lived in abject poverty in Glasgow, all of the Irish. They lived in an area called the Gorbals. And if you have any Irish relatives that go back to the Glasgow Irish in the Fort Augustus area, they had the same kind of a journey from Glasgow to PEI. Back to the present again. This is Ballycastle, and this is the harbour they would have left from. This is Scotland. This is the Mull of Kintyre. Now this next one warmed my heart. So Kathy and I arrived, and we drove up to Antrim, and we're going into Ballycastle down the main road. And you don't quite know, I don't know of any relatives that are there. It's been, they had 1830 since the Gillans left. And we look to our right on Main Street heading for our Airbnb, and look at that. And we found out across the street there was a barber who somebody told me her husband was a Gillan, so of course I went in and had a chat with her. And we found a Gillan farm outside of Ballycastle, and it was wonderful. So the Glasgow Irish, I'm just going to go back to my first book on this because the Glasgow Irish it's an interesting topic. There was a Gillan family of 5 arrived in Glasgow. They're there for 5 years, 1825 to 1830. Now they had 2 children born there. Remember, they came with 3, so they had 2 more born in Glasgow. They had Bernard and Mary. Now this is Bernard's 200th birthday today. And I have a 6-year-old grandchild who turned 6 today. And his name is Patrick Bernard. How perfect is that? Mary was born in 1828. The reason, I'm going to talk about Bernard just briefly lately, but the reason I want you to remember Mary is that Bernard is a success story and Mary's is a sad story. So we'll pick her up back in PEI. So this is the priest, rogue, businessman, landowner, who was, believe it or not, the parish priest at St. Andrews in Scotland, where the Gillans were going to church. And believe it or not, he was from Prince Edward Island. What were the chances to be in 1825? And believe it or not, he owned 10,000 acres of land on PEI in Lot 36, south of the Hillsborough River, across from Scotchford, Fort Augustus area, back the Monaghan Road, done up through that area. He owned all of that area. It was all wilderness, no settlers, and he was paying taxes, and he needed people on his land, and he saw all these poor Irish people and said, who would like to come to PEI, and you'll have, 50 to 100 acres of land that you can lease from me. He was a bit of a scoundrel. He wasn't well liked by the tenants at all. So he's not, the history books are half kind to him. I'm not kind at all. So there's 32 families put their hands up, said they would go. They went in the Corsair. They arrived on May 19th, 1830, and settled in the Fort Augustus area. So the sad part of this is that when they walked from Ballycastle to Glasgow, they thought they were going back, and they never got back. And none of those 32 families did. The other interesting thing is that when I looked at the birth certificates for Bernard and Mary that were born in Scotland, that their godparents that stood for them were relatives. So there was probably a bunch of them, family went to Glasgow together. And then some of them, as far as the Gillans concerned, there was only one family put their hand up. This is where they landed. And so this is James Gillan's property. And those of you who knew Catherine Hennessy and Cranberry Wharf, I discovered when I was doing this research that I had spent time out there and didn't know it. Her property is right next door to the Gillan property. Cranberry Wharf, that little jug out there, and these are all Glasgow Irish. So this was James Gillan's. This is where they landed. This photo was taken. I'm on, if you know, the Five Houses Road, which sort of runs parallel a bit to the Fort Augustus Road. I'm shooting towards the Hillsborough River. And I sort of suspected that his house was down in here somewhere, because it would be closer to the water. And so behind me is his property going right up to the Fort Augustus Road. 96 acres on the water. I don't know quite, there was only about 10 or 12 of them got property on the water. I don't know how quite he did that. but he was probably a little bit of a leader in the community because he was one of the founders, he was on the parish council of St. Patrick's Church when they started and buying the land for the cemetery and all of that. He was right in the middle of all that. So and he was illiterate, by the way. But not stupid.
What?
I'm sorry? Illiterate. Yes, sorry. We went looking for the property. It was an interesting day. We were next door. David Wheel was there, and David decided he wanted to come with us. David was as excited as we were, I think, to try and find the property and see if we could find where the house was. And lo and behold, this is Kathy with a look of satisfaction on her face, looking into the cellar of that 1830 home. Now, let's pick up Mary again. Mary was born in 1828. There was nothing in the church records that said she died in Scotland. So that meant she made the trip over. But they had another daughter, Mary, born in 1832. And you can be sure when you're going through your records, if you find a name repeating, it means that first child died. So they had a daughter, Anne, born in 1831. So if Mary if Mary wasn't living then, that girl would have had a different name. But then the next daughter in 1832 was named Mary. So we know that little girl is probably buried somewhere in that property, and that's why I wanted to find it. Irish immigration to PEI, generally, there were 10,000 arrived between 1800 and 1845, 3,000 from County Monaghan. So, just a brief note on this. So, the Monaghan Irish, they go from 830 on. And from 1830 on, there was planned immigration. There were ships came over with a shipload of Irish planning on settling here. Prior to 1830, if your ancestors like mine did, my McCarthy and Mooney ancestors arrived, in the 1820s, they were sort of stragglers, It wasn't an organized voyage, and so you get that. They came from Newfoundland, they came from New Brunswick, they came from Nova Scotia, and they came from various parts of Ireland. But in 1830, with the Monaghan's, with the Glasgow Irish and that first boatload, it became planned. And so when you find in the 1830s, they formed communities and lived together. Like the Moonies lived in Eastern Kings, and they lived with Scottish and English settlers, English and Catholic and Protestant. You don't find that with the Monaghan's when they arrive. They have communities, Irish, Catholic. They are, and they you'll see it here. So here's some of the ships that came over in the 1830s. And these are all planned settlements to PEI. And a lot of Monaghan Irish on those ships. And of course what happened was that the Port Augustus area, for example, the land gets taken up and then they keep moving eastward. And you get the St. Patrick's Road, and the Burns Road, Peaks, and the Baldwin's Road. And down in the Montague area and whatnot. And they just keep moving east. And they settled, Kelly's Cross, and Emerald, all those names. One thing you should remember is that there are no famine Irish on PEI to speak of. There was only one famine ship arrived. That was in 1847, and it was a mistake. The ship wasn't supposed to come to PEI, and the harbor master, whether made a mistake or pity, let them in, and the medical examiner either misdiagnosed them or was sorry for them and let them in. And so it's a sad story. There was 25 of them died before they ever got to PEI, and a number of them, they were quarantined, and there's stories in the paper about these carts going out to the Catholic cemetery on Longworth Avenue to bury the inhabitants of the Lady Constable. But I don't know a whole lot more about them. But most Irish, PEI is unique that way. So island studies, that's one of them. That's a big one, is that you'll find famine Irish all through North America. You will not find them in PEI, except for a handful. And I can't help but make one political comment on it. This is the family memorial in Dublin on the canal. The Almighty indeed sent the potato blight, but the English created the famine. They were exporting grain while people were dying in the streets and in the fields of Ireland. It was just pitiful. Another thing about Irish immigration is that we were latecomers. All of the riverfront property was gone, and of course that was the highway, and you could fish it. The one little brief exception, I guess, is the Monaghan Irish. They got some land on the Hillsborough River. They locked a dozen of them. Other than that, you know, where the arrows point there, that's the Moonies in Eastern Kings, and the other area is sort of the Morel Rear Peaks area, which is, you know, rough, hard to grow crops there in the early days. And after you got the trees out of the way. So, and that says 1833, but that date could have been 1825, or it didn't change much. The water frontage was all gone by the time the Irish came on. But they turned interior PEI into very, very valuable farmland. So pioneer challenges, of course that's the big one, right? Ireland was the least forested country in Europe. And this is what they came to. They didn't know a whole lot about cutting down trees, and they didn't have very good equipment, you know, primitive tools, hacking that. And you know, when the Gillans arrived in 1830, on May 19th, 1830, and they have 5 kids, and they go up the Hillsborough River, what do they do where do they live? How did they do that? We don't know. Somebody was kind to them. Not the mosquitoes.
No.
There were predatory challenges. This was a photo taken in the 1890s in Charlottetown. You're not going to see a whole lot of conservation, environmental information here. There were bounties on them. I mean, people were worried. They had encounters with bears. From 1820 to 1860, there were 1,000 bounties collected on black bears. The last bear was killed in 1927, and the last lynch in 1890. But you know, you've got to remember, they might have a few animals. They have some trees cleared with a few crops around the stumps. And you know, if they had a few cattle, they'd be wandering through the woods. I mean, so you know, they're worried about their children. And Michael Mooney, there's a great story in my book. Michael Mooney, his brother and father encountered a black bear, and there's great detail about a mother bear and 2 cubs. So it was real fierce. So we say no conservation here. They just wanted to get rid of them, and they did. Health and hygiene. This is a sad part. I mean, in the 1800s in Canada, it was called the world of little coffins. So many children died. 1 of every 3 died before the age of 5. When I saw that, I said it's wrong, and I went looking, and I couldn't. It's similar numbers wherever you look. It's just scary. I just listed some of the diseases there. The interesting one that's not there is smallpox. Smallpox was a big killer. The other interesting thing about it is they had a vaccine for smallpox in the late 1700s. So why were people dying of smallpox? Well, they were poor. There was no free medicine at the time. They were living in a wilderness area. They weren't very well educated. And maybe they were anti-vaccine, I don't know. Childbirth, of course, was a big killer of women, young women, and accidents in the woods and on the farm. They didn't bathe too often, twice a year. And of course, you know the story of how they bathed, that when they did have a bath, they would go by order of seniority, parents first, then the oldest kids. So the youngest was the last one in, hence don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, it would be so dirty. They just cohabited with vermin, lice, cockroaches, anything that crawled, and anything that flew. So they had to keep their windows covered. And that, you know, that would be, mean they had dark homes, or if they wanted to have bright homes, they had company. You know, and disease carried by mosquitoes and other things. No dental hygiene, so they lost their teeth at an early age. And you see that in some of the old photos, sunken cheeks, not smiling, pretty somber. There are probably other reasons for all of that too. The women probably had about 18 kids. But, and speaking of women, I mean, they worked in the fields, they worked in the home, cooked a lot of pot meals so they could be in the fields, boiled dinners, and you know, you're Irish, you know all about this stuff. It's really interesting, potato being the main, there's a story about an Irish couple that the woman took over the potatoes and she had them preserved, and I can't remember if she preserved them in any way, keep them, and that became their potato crop then when they finally got the land clear. The land problem, I'm not going to talk much about that because that's a day in itself, but they arrive here and they find out that Samuel Holland, who divided the island so nicely into 20,000-acre lots, townships, was all given away by the English crown to their friends in 1767, and that's where the name lot comes from the lottery. But in lots 38 and 39, there is a proprietor named Charles Worrell, who in the middle 1800s said that he would sell his land. It's hard to figure out if he did it out of altruism or out of need. I've heard both things, that he had some financial problems, but I think he was a good guy too. It's a little bit like slave owners, you know, a lot of them were bad, there was a few good ones, and proprietors, most of them were bad, but there were a few good ones. So when they arrived here, they were better off. Number one, they had written leases, and in Ireland they had oral leases that could be thrown off their land at any time. And they had 50 to 75 acres, not 5 or 10. But there was a real power imbalance because now my Mooney ancestors were educated. They were stonemasons. I'm not sure about the McCarthys, but I sort of think that they were. I know the O'Neills were educated. They all lived in the south, but the last two. But the Gillans were not educated. So this is a typical lease agreement. This is one between Reverend John MacDonald and James Gillan. So you know it's sad, you know. See his X. But look down here. MacDonald was represented by his attorney, and there would have been a land agent there too, and an Irish settler who couldn't read or write. These documents, that's the first page. They went on for about 3 pages, all legalese. And it's really interesting. It's hard to find a period in the whole thing. It just keeps going on and on and on and on and on. It takes your breath away. So if you want to take a look at PEI, population growth, and a big Irish influence on it. In 1822, the population of PEI was 24,600. It had almost quadrupled by 1871. So this is the period right in here where you start getting a lot of the Irish immigration up to 1845. The famine, by the way, was 1847. But that didn't affect PEI's population. So just remember, just keep that 94,000 in 1871. I'm going to carry that on to the next slide. Take you right up to 1961. So look back there in 1871, there's your 94,000. Now go up to 1961. 104,000. Went up 10,000 in about 100 years. And what happened? Out-migration starting in the late 1800s into the 1900s, and it was went crazy in the 1930s and 40s. And if you have ancestors, Irish ancestors anyway, in PEI, I'll bet you my bottom dollar that you have relatives in Boston and Maine and you name it. That's where they went. It was a north-south route. So, finding place, the Gillan family. First generation, tenants, lot 36. Second generation, my man Bernard, my great-great-grandfather, owned 400 acres at one point. And that man could not read or write. Why did he have so much land? Well, he bought an initial 150 from the landlord. He could pay for it over 10 years. And it's really good. The proprietors had to keep estate records of money they took in and money that went out. So they're great documents, and you can find Marion Gillan buying his property from the early 1850s till the early 1860s. And he bought enough land so that he could give land for his kids, because they left Ireland for their kids to give them opportunity. So by 1850, the Gillans have found place. The McCarthys went, as we said earlier, first generation to COVID. They were tenants. Second generation landowners. Daniel McCarthy owned 245 acres at one point. Why did he own so much land? For his kids. He wanted to leave his farm that he was on to one son, but he wanted his other son to have another property. And that's the property the other son had, by the way, and that's where my mother was raised in Marion. The Mooney family. So this is the Mooney property in the Greenvale, and there's two Greenvales. Well, there's only one Greenvale now. This Greenvale has been written off the map by the provincial government. But this one is the one east of Surrey, about 4 miles east of Surrey. The Greenvale Road still exists. So that picture was taken in the Greenvale Road, and it's a heritage road now. All through there, it's all heritage roads. There's nobody lives in there, but my God, they're beautiful roads. And it's all farmland. And what's not farmland is being cleared for mainly potatoes. So this is where my Mooney ancestors lived. Their house was up in there. And this there's 150 acres here, 100, sorry, and that is still farmed by Mooney's, Mooney and Sons in St. Catharines. I don't know how many hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of acres they own, but one of the properties is that original homestead property. So that takes us to the matriarchs. So that sort of sets up that they had a little bit of oomph to them, those women. And they came from a line of people that knew adversity and figured out how to get around it. And they would probably say their problems would probably pale in comparison to what they found. So this is my mom, Marion Gillan, her mother, Jennie McCarthy. That's my dad. He would be killed 2 years later. Me, and this is Chester. Chester's here somewhere. Chester, put your hand up. Hasn't changed much. And some McCarthy cousins. So what I want to do now is talk about these two women and how they managed the bad hand that they were given. So I already told you about this. So I'm going to be talking about Jennie Mooney first. Her husband Ed McCarthy is going to die at age 40. She was 34 years old with 4 kids. My mom was their oldest child, and as I said earlier, I'm going to talk about the grandparents that played a huge role here. So there's Jennie and Ed marrying in 1909. It's quite interesting that he's from Marion and she's from east of Surrey. And you wonder, how in the name of God did that happen? Because, you know, travel wasn't all that easy. But they met at a wedding. And both are best friends. And Jennie's best friend was a school teacher who got assigned to the Senate Road School in Morel. And that's sort of how all that came about. So, believe it or not, these two are couples. I don't have an old picture of him, and I don't have a young picture of her. And I can tell you, I had a whack of photos. I mean, the McCarthys were great to take photos. And it's a wonderful history. You'll see that in the book. Loads and loads of photos, and my mother kept them all. But we don't have, I don't know why we don't have a younger picture of, so she was a Senate. Mary Jennie McCarthy. And I tell you, the Senates had some oomph to them too. They were very successful farmers in the Morel area. And Mary was a woman who you didn't push around, but she was a wonderful grandmother. And Gillan, he dies in 1912, okay? And my mother was born in 1911, so my mom didn't have any relationship with her grandfather McCarthy, but boys did share a relationship with her. And there's my mom. Now, what you can tell from that is the McCarthys had some money. Just take a look at the little thing. The dress, the necklace, the boots. And it's a photo that would have been taken in a studio. So that would have been a trip to Charlottetown, and all that entailed money. They were successful. And this is my mother with her grandmother Sinnott. They were very close. They slept together every night until Grandma McCarthy gets sick. And my mother in her tapes they just had a wonderful, wonderful relationship. So Mom had 6 years with the McCarthy grandmother. So Karen is going to be my mom's voice, and this is the first one. And Mom in the interview just talked the last part of her grandmother's life.
And this is kind of a confession that she wanted to clear up before her mom passed.
Grandma.
I was taken to Grandma's bedroom and had to tell her the horrible story. I had been out gathering eggs with Grandma, and she had asked me to hold some while she went to gather others. I squeezed too hard and one of them broke. Afraid of getting a scolding, I hid the egg in the straw and didn't tell Grandma. Of course, when I told her, Grandma took me in her arms, embraced me, and cried. That was the only thing that ever came between us, and we got that straightened out before she went to heaven.
So Grandma McCarthy dies. Oh, I should mention something else about her. Just to know how remarkable a woman Mary Jennie McCarthy was. In 1915, the year before this picture was taken, now, if you lived in Morel Rear, the Morel area, going to Charlottetown would be an excursion. I mean, you know, get a horse harnessed up, get to a train station, get on the train, get into the big city and all that kind of stuff. In 1915, she traveled by herself to Denver, Colorado, and stopped in Boston on the way to visit her son there. Hard to believe. And when she was in Denver, staying at her son's place, 1915, we have a picture of her in a car, getting a ride in a car. Now, there wouldn't be too many people in 1915 in PEI saw a car, much less ride in a car. And she, a woman traveling alone in 1915, and couldn't read or write. And I didn't know she couldn't read or write until I looked at the will, and there was her X. Ed McCarthy then dies the next year at age 40. And my mother had something to say about that too. By the way, he had a heart condition. He died in February. Spent over the Christmas holidays, he was in a hospital in Charlottetown. And you had to pay for that. And when he came back home, he had a nurse with him. And they had hired help. So we think the family story, I couldn't find any record of it, is that he also had a distributorship for barbed wire on PEI. Because he did have money, and we're going to see when we get to, after he died in his will, you know, there was money. Sure. So my mom talks about her father's death.
My mother put Chester, who was 5 years old, and I to bed that night, and Papa kissed us goodnight. He asked Chester if the dog had been around home that day. We had a lovely collie dog, and after my father became ill, the dog would wander away from home in the daytime. While Mama was upstairs just finishing with us, the nurse called her to come down quickly. She rushed down. Then I heard them praying. Neighbors came in. I knew there was something seriously wrong. I heard Ed Walsh, who was my father's best friend, calling Surrey to send a message to Andrew Mooney that Ed McCarthy had passed away at 8 o'clock that night. Then I was crying. I told Chester, warned him not to go to sleep, that Papa had died. But of course, he was only 5 and went to sleep. Mama heard me crying. I came down to find my father's remains in the bedroom. I knelt down and said a prayer and came out of the bedroom to a very sad house. I went into the parlor, and I remember my father lying in the casket. I was sobbing, and the hearse out in the front of the house, it was pretty grim looking. I remember the funeral, not the mass at the church. Aunt Emmy Walsh and Mother Teresa, that's Annie Walsh, took me by the hand. Uncle Frank and Aunt Mamie had Chester. Grandpa Mooney and Uncle Andrew Mooney had Mama, her father and her brother. It was pretty grim at the graveside. At that time, the pile of clay was there beside the open grave. The mourners all stood around until the pallbearers filled in the grave with this frozen, hard clay. She was sobbing at this point. It was breaking my heart to think they were covering up our dear good father with that frozen clay and stones.
So my grandmother, Jennie Mooney, gets home from the funeral, and she has to decide, what's she going to do here? How's she going to keep this operation going? She had a few choices. She could have sold the farm and all of that. She decided she was going to run it. Now, the interesting thing about my grandmother is that she wasn't like those women that I talked about, those pioneer women. She didn't know what the inside of a barn looked like all of her life. She never went to the barn, never went to the fields. So now she had to run a 70-acre farm and figure it out, and she did. So these are the 4 kids that she had. This was taken the year after her father died in 1920. Right after Ed's death, Jennie's parents came from the Surrey area to live with her. This is the guy I said was my hero, Andrew, his wife Jane O'Halloran, and I mean I think it saved the family to have that stability there. They were retired at this point. He had sold off his businesses, and they were there. So Mom got to spend the next 6 or 7 years with her maternal grandmother and grandfather. So they decided to have an auction. Jennie was advised by the neighbors, there's some grain and oats and whatnot that can be sold, and get rid of the animals, just keep what you need. The equipment is all in really good shape. Ed McCarthy had a really good reputation for that. He had a wonderful carpentry shop and forge. And so 2 weeks after the death, Jennie then had to be there and witness his auction, and all of everything that her husband loved going out the driveway.
I remember women came. Aunt Mamie, Liza, that's Mrs. Ed Walsh, Violet Sinnott, Dr. Sinnott's aunt, and all the neighboring women. They had a huge wash boiler that normally was used to heat water when they were washing to boil the white clothes. They had that full of sandwiches. They had cooked beef at our house and put it through the food chopper. Made mayonnaise for the sandwiches. Everything was done at home in those days. For seats, they took the kitchen table out and had planks all around the kitchen, covered with wagon buffalo robes. The auctioneer, Harry Cox, and the officials ate in the dining room. The women cooked a hot dinner for them.
This is one page from Ed's will that has people that attended the auction and what they paid. So just a wonderful, wonderful document. If you have family at all in any vicinity of Morel, in lots, 38, 39, 40, right through there, you'll probably find them on one of these pages. And I can tell you what they were doing on February the 26th, 1919. So you can see from this one page, she took in about $3,500. And they had a car, and you got $500 for that. Just to put that in perspective, you're talking $65,000 or $70,000 in today's terms. She kept enough to run the farm, a few cows, pigs, chickens. That was the car. That was a car that they had. And they had a 1918 Ford. There were only 626 cars registered on PDI in 1918. Most of them were in Summerside and Charlottetown. My grandmother running the farm kept a bit of a ledger. This is another, I just love this document. She's keeping track, this is in 1925, and she's keeping track of the hours that the people work. And anyway, it's all there, The interesting thing is that she talks about, having, one day with Bob until tea time. And I was thinking, why would somebody leave at tea time? But back then, tea time was supper time. Now, we talked about eggs earlier, and that broken egg. And when my mother told me that story, all I could think of was, what's the big deal? Like a broken egg, okay, I know you hid it from your grandmother, but there was good money in eggs. And Grandma McCarthy, when my grandmother, Jennie Mooney, moved into the McCarthy house, she's got Mary Sinnott, who lives there, and this young bride coming in, pretty daunting. And she said, so she allowed her mother-in-law to continue with the eggs. And that was huge, because there was money in the eggs, and she would have her own spending money. This is about a 6-month period in 1941. Almost $75. That's $1,600 in eggs. Anyway, she pulled it off. By 1935, the kids are grown. This is my mom. She's teaching school at the time, single. Chester McCarthy at the head of the horse. She's got the farm running. And that was in the will. She decided in the will that the firm would eventually go to Chester. So Chester McCarthy was 5 years old when his father died. So she had to hang on to the farm until he got old enough to do that. And Hilda and Cecil, he was working on the farm at the time, and my grandmother. My mom was teaching school in Burn Road in 1931. And Jenny pulled it off. And that's a picture of her in the 50s with some of her grandchildren. There's another 6 or 7 or 8 came along after that. She was a good-looking woman. She could have, there probably would have been guys in the neighborhood liked to have a good-looking woman with a 70-acre farm and was doing well. Not for her. No, not at all interested. My mom and dad. I know I'm running over here. There's Mom, age 24. She's in Boston there. She found out that Boston wasn't everything it was meant to be, and she couldn't wait to get home to PDI. My dad, at 22, he loved baseball and he loved music, and he's got both of them going there. Playing the auto harp. And this is his ball uniform, and people look at that and say, that's not a Peaks Bombers emblem, and they're right, it's not. Because the Peaks Bombers weren't called the Peaks Bombers, they were called the Peaks Hawks. They didn't become the Peaks Bombers until after the Second World War. He worked at Holland Stabbert as a pattern maker during his single years and after they get married. Mom and Dad married in 1940, and they started having kids, but they were a happy young couple. Karen?
This is the discussion about their finances and looking ahead. Joe said before long he would be bringing home $100 a week. I remember I turned around and said to him, well, I hope we will be as happy then, Joe, as we are now. I can still hear the laugh he gave and said, oh, we'll be happy for sure, but we could do with a little more money. And then he said, you have to get some good clothes, Marion. You dress the children well, and I have good clothes for being on the road. You are the one doing without. Whenever we get more money, you are going to be dressed properly. And then he said that the next thing is going to be our home. We are going to build a house in a nice neighborhood, and it's going to be the kind of house that we want.
So that little discussion with Mom and Dad took place just a couple of years before he died. He buys into Holland Stanford in 1946. They had to come up with a business loan, and because of that, they were renting a house, and they were going to build one. And so there's the crew. Dad loved his family. There's one missing. My brother Joe was born in 1953, just a few months before Dad's accident. And we don't have any pictures of the five of us prior to the crash. And so Dad loved to fly. He flew out of Twin Rivers Airstrip. It was called Twin Rivers because it was in Johnson's River area, situated between the Hillsborough River and Johnson's River. So this is a painting. This is the plane that Dad flew. Dad didn't own his own plane. He had a friend. It was really interesting. He had a friend who owned a plane and didn't have his pilot's license. Dad had his pilot's license but didn't have a plane. Can you think of a better friendship than that? This is the Piper Cub, 1941. So here, this is the hangar. This is where the Brazells own the strip. This was their farm. And this is a strip over here where the plane only needed, one of those little Piper Cubs only needed like a football field and a half at the most to take off. So Dad would land in Peaks and in Morel in the fields next to the houses, right? It'd be quite a thing in the 1940s to see a plane come in. And we're going to get to the accident, so our car would have been parked up in this area here, probably near the hangar, in that area, and crashed right there. I did put that in there just to give you an idea of the size of the airplane. It's not very big. You can see the guy standing there. And the Brazel, by the way, is at the top. He owned the airstrip, a good friend of Dad's, and he pulled Dad's body out of the plane. And it was never the same afterwards.
He told me the story when I was a boy.
What's that?
He told me the story when I was a boy.
Really?
He did. And it stuck with me.
Yeah. Yeah, he was a great guy. In the book, I do a side story on them and call him the Quiet Hero. But their family suffered almost as much as our family did. So this is May 17th, 1953. So just let me set it up for you. We live in Houston Street, right next to the service station that Kim saved, the turreted service station. Our house was butted right up to the service station. It's an empty lot now. As a matter of fact, when they were digging the footings for what they're doing there now in the corner, I could see where they dug the hole. I could see the water pipes of our house coming out through This is my sister Arlene. She's making her first communion. The priest lived next door. The church at the time, the Holy Redeemer Church, was where St. Jean's School is. So there was no residence there for the priest, so they lived right next door. And they were really good friends. Father McClellan, who's going to be mentioned here later, he anointed Dad. He and Dad, Father McClellan and Dad would have a catch in the driveway. I mean, they're just like brothers. And he had to be called to the accident scene. You're going to hear she's going to mention other people in the family. So that's Arlene, she's 7. Chester was 9, and my sister Marjorie 11. So their names are going to crop up there. So, because it's a big ceremony, we're going to Morel that day to have supper at my grandmother's in Morel. We're going to stop in Peaks on the way to my dad's family, just drop in and say hello. And Mom had a good friend who lived on the St. Patrick's Road. Her name was Geraldine Rygerson, and she became Geraldine Cullen, school teacher. So she phoned and said, could she get a ride out to St. Patrick's Road with us? Mom said, yeah, come along. So picked her up on the way. At dinner time, the phone rang, and Pius Blackett, who owned the plane, said to Dad, would it be possible for you to go be at the airstrip today? I have some people who want to go up in the plane. So Dad turns to Mom and said, could we stop at the airstrip? It's on the way. And Mom said, of course. And Dad said, it'll only be an hour. And my mother said, there's more than 60 minutes in an airport hour. But they went, and that's why we were all at the accident scene.
So Frank's dad has taken another passenger out. And this is his mother describing what happened. I looked back through the window and I saw the plane coming with one wing dipped. Looked like it was useless. I said to Jerry, the plane is in trouble, and I got out of the car with the baby in my arms. She said, give me the baby. Marjorie just flew like lightning across the airport. The plane was still falling. She was saying, don't let Daddy be killed. I went after her and was yelling, come back, Marjorie, Marjorie, come back. You and Arlene were roaring, Mommy, come back. I had gone a little piece, and I thought that if I go down there and the plane goes down, I'll meet a sight I may never forget. When I got back to the car, I was wringing my hands and saying Joe was going to be killed. Then it landed. It didn't seem long till it burst into flames. You could see the fire running out along the wing. Oh dear. Oh God, I was kneeling down, screaming to God to keep Joe alive. Wonder I didn't go out of my mind. Then Emmett Brazel came up to the car with the 2 kids, Marjorie and Chester, and he just screamed at us for everybody to stay in the car and not to go down near the plane. He was half out of his mind because he thought the engine would explode. Then a car left the crash site, and I thought maybe they are taking Joe to the hospital. I was yelling to God to keep him alive until he would get to the hospital. And I remember Chester saying, you needn't pray because Daddy is lying there dead. Can't you see him, Mommy, lying there in his gray suit and wine socks? They're back at the house now by the airstrip. Everyone was crying. It was a long, narrow kitchen, and we sat on kitchen chairs along one wall. Emmett returned and took me into a room off the kitchen. He closed the door behind me and said, sit down now, Marion. This is going to be hard to take. I sat on the side of the bed, and he looked me square in the face, and he said, he was killed instantly. I remember saying, my God, Emmett, what will become of the 5 children? He said, you will make out okay, Marion. You have friends, and they all stand by you. But Emmett, friends can't do much. It took Joe and I to make a living for us all. I came out of the room, stepping along pretty bravely, until they saw my face. 4 little voices saying, "Mommy, tell us about Daddy. Did Daddy get killed?" And I said, "Yes, dears, Daddy was killed." Then the crying of you all, screaming, bawling, heartbrokenly. I got you around me and I was telling them that we had to be brave. We can't cry too much. We'll go home and live together. We won't have Daddy, but we'll be living here. Father McCullen had gone to anoint Joe at the crash scene, and then he arrived, and I remember the tears just pouring down his face. I was sitting there like a zombie. I wasn't crying. I asked him to give us his blessing. I always thought that alone brought me through it. Couldn't have done it on my own. He gave us his blessing and prayed over all of us. They then go back to the family home in town. Then the floodgates opened. I said, "I can't go in the house without Joe. We left here an hour or so ago and now he's gone. Oh God," I was just bawling. Father McClellan said, "Come on now, Marion. You did so well. Keep on, dear. You have to face it." He kept saying that right through. And the morning of the funeral, he came in and said, "The hardest part is yet to come, and you have done so well." The wake was on Monday and Tuesday. And then Marion continues her interview with Frank, and just a reminder that Frank was 4 at the time of the crash. When that casket started to be lowered down, Frank, it was just like they were tearing my heart out. And I thought, there is Joe going before my eyes, and I'm going to be left all alone. You might say, I have been alone ever since. We put a drag along from here, don't we?
Yeah. Just to set this next piece up, Mom and Dad had talked about, Mom said at one point, whatever happened, if anything ever happened to you, what am I going to do? And it wasn't all that long again before the crash. And so Mom and Dad had this discussion about what the plan might be.
I think I messed up the order, sorry.
It's okay.
He took a step over to the pantry door. He's shaving over the sink at this time, and pointed out the pantry window saying, "There's a new car in the driveway with only a couple $100 left on it. It is insured in your name. Sell the car and get your money. There are 2 insurances. Cash them in and get your money. Get your money from Hal and Stafford, so sell the shares. We don't have any bills. Keep a few roomers and boarders here and drag along," which was a saying Joe had, "until you decide what you're going to do." That's exactly what I did, though I didn't get the money from Hal and Stafford, as you know.
That's okay.
Do you want me to do the loneliness
No,
one?
it's okay. I'm running over.
Okay.
So that was the story in the newspaper on Monday. So Mom finds herself with the 5 of us. This picture was taken the year after Dad's death. And the question is, how is she going to survive? No income. So she decides she's going to take in boarders. We have this big 3-story house, old, drafty old thing, wood furnace, no central heat, just a wood furnace with a grate in the hall, wood stove in the kitchen, no electric stove in those days, no electric fridge. We had an ice box, but it was home, and so she could afford the rent. During the wake, there was the landlord, really nice landlady, came to her and said, don't you worry, you and the family can stay here, you always paid your rent, and I really like you as tenants, and there'd be no problem. She died 3 months later, the building was sold, and the person who came in did not have the same attitude at all. He started renovating, and he was going to evict the family. And Mom just went through months of pure hell and worry because if we were evicted, she could never find another house that could hold 5 boarders and the 6 of us. It just wouldn't exist, and so we'd be on the street, and keeping the family together would be a problem. And she could have gone to Morel. She had all kinds of offers, but she wanted to stay in Charlottetown. And the reason she wanted to stay in Charlottetown was she wanted to make sure we all got an education beyond grade 10. And getting grade 11 and 12 education in those days, especially if you lived in rural PI, but anywhere, well, here's why. Well, there's 79 Euston Street, by the way. I love the streetscape shot. You see the service station right next to us. We butted right up to it. And, you know, it was a residential neighborhood. Stop sign at the corner of Queen and Euston. So, here's school enrollment for 1957. You know, grade 1, almost 2,700. By the time you get to grade 8, it's down to 16, and then there was a big drop off at grade 8, and only 1,200. And that started grade 10, by the way. That's not finishing. But look, and that's where the public school system ended after that. If you went on to 11 and 12, you had to pay tuition at St. Dunstan's or Prince of Wales. And that's what, and you also had to write matriculation exams, entrance exams, all that stuff. So it weeded out most people. Mom was determined that we were going to get beyond grade 10. She had gone and done her teacher training in Prince of Wales, and 2 of her siblings had, and the only one who didn't go on was my Uncle Chester, who was going to take over the farm. So this is why we stayed in Charlottetown, and it's pretty difficult to understand why, because, you know, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, security, shelter is the first thing, and education is way up there, but somehow she was determined that we were going to get an education. So she found herself in the same position as her early Irish ancestors, renting a property under constant fear of eviction. Queen Square School turned out to be a savior for us, but it was a difficult run. She had been, this is in 1955, the spring of 1955, 2 years after Dad's accident. She actually did a term substitute teaching at Queen Square. So when the position came up, the person who was leaving went to Mom first and said, "I'm going to be leaving, get your application in." And Mom did. So when she went to the interview with the superintendent, she was pretty confident that, you know, she had a good record in the one school. She had taught at Queen Square, and then she has the interview with the superintendent.
He told me no school board would recognize my application unless it was out of sympathy to save the city from paying me relief. Strong words. He said, "If your children are sick, you will have to be home with them." And I said, "No, Dr. Parker, I would have a permanent housekeeper. I have Blue Cross and coverage through Holland Stafford." He didn't pay much attention to my feeble responses. So she got another recommendation to pay a visit to Colonel Leo MacDonald, who was the principal of Queen Square School.
Now, just let me interject for a second. So after the interview with the superintendent, she was absolutely heartbroken and dejected. And some friends said, "Look, you know, Leo F. MacDonald is a fair-minded guy. Why don't you go talk to him?" Now think of that. The superintendent had already said, "You're not getting the job." For most people, you wouldn't want to go behind his back or over his head or under his head, whatever you call it. But Mom was desperate, so one evening she goes to Leo F. MacDonald's house on Hillsborough Street.
When I was leaving, he shook hands and said, "You can count yourself in Queen Square School." I'll never forget the walk home from his Hillsborough Street home. I was running and walking, laughing and crying, and if anybody was watching, they would think I was going out of my trees. All I was thinking was now I was able to keep the children together. Now we will have enough money to stay where we are. They can't put us on the street anymore. They can't take the kids.
So obviously that's where the title of the book came from. Mom's comment that they can't take the kids. So at this point, the reason she says that they can't put us on the street is, but now she has a permanent salary. If the landlord says get out, now she can go and she gets to get another place. She doesn't need the boarders anymore. So it really was the savior. Got to tell you just one short story. I'm running way over it, but I can't help it. Mom was very Catholic. And when she was living under this veil of eviction, the nuns at Notre Dame said to her, Marion, you got to pray to St. Joseph. He is the saint that looks after homes for little kids. And you really should do that. And of course, Mom did. Meanwhile, the landlord has relented a bit because he can't renovate this damn old building. And so he said, some of the men, I think, got to her, some of Dad's friends, said, you're driving this woman crazy. For God's sakes, give her some stability. So he said that he would give her a 1-year lease. He's going to make 2 quick increases to the rent, but then he would give her a 1-year lease, which was a little bit of respite. The letter came in on the Feast of St. Joseph. Mom worked the playgrounds to get some money in the summertime because teachers are only paid over 10 months at the time. And she got a home. This property was owned by, the lot was owned by the Catholic Church. And a priest, a Holy Redeemer priest had come from out west and understood the condominium system. And he knew there were all these Catholic families that just couldn't get loans enough to build houses. But he figured if they pooled the resources, they could build this townhouses, this condominium. And there's 8 houses. There were 7 men that the church said, yeah, you guys are it. Mom heard there was 1 spot left. She gave him a call. And, you know, the priests were living next door, so we probably had a little bit of in. And anyway, she was the 8th person. And you know, some of the people living here that couldn't afford to build a house, Dr. Burge was our next door neighbor. Bill Ledwell lived in the last house, worked for the Guardian and the film board. Vince McIntyre, federal civil servant. You know, it was hard to get money for a house. So they could do it this way. Now here's the part that absolutely floored me in the interview. They needed to have a $1,640 down payment for the mortgage and $250, I think, for the land or whatever. Now Mom was making $1,700 a year teaching. And she said, and as soon as they said that, she said, that's not a problem. When she started teaching, her first school was Burns Road School. She decided she would put away some money in an investment every month. And she did that all through her 10 years of teaching. And when she got married, she just kept making the contributions, I guess. When they bought into Holland Stafford, you know, Dad said, no, you keep your money. You know, we're not going to take that. And when she was struggling with that landlord and everything, she didn't use it then either. It was just absolutely amazing. She had this pot of money that she just saved it. So she had the money for the down payment, and we moved into a house that had central heating, a fridge, an electric stove, a finished basement, not clay, a front lawn and a back lawn.
Flush toilet?
No, we had a toilet in the old house, we didn't have a shower. But the creme de la creme, 2 years later, a TV. And 2 stations. You remember that? Do you remember watching Test Pattern, the Indian Head? I mean, you watch it all, it didn't do anything, but it was more fun than was there before. Mom said in the interview, "What a relief for me to know that no one could knock on that door and tell me I had to get out." She retired from teaching in 1976, and she saw her last boy get a university degree in 1979. I found these notes when I was doing some research. I had never seen it before. She was helping one of her cousins with genealogy. And she wrote down, "I reached my goal to educate my children. They are capable of providing a good life for their children." My Irish ancestors would have said that in the 1820s. And she never told us we had to get an education. She never preached it at all. All by example. She was teaching, taking courses, upgrading the whole time. And so it just became natural for us. She died January 21, 1999, 1 month into her 88th year, and she had a wonderful retirement. She had a cottage, she flew everywhere. By the way, I should mention, the drag-along plan, where Dad said, get the Holland Starboard money, they wouldn't buy the shares. The insurance was null and void, because Dad was flying a private plane. So she had the car. She sold the car. That was the only money she had. But she made it work. Her mortgage payment in the 1980s, she had got a 25-year mortgage that did that back in the day. It was $91 a month. We died twice. First on her death date, and again the last time someone says her name. That's why I wrote the book. Sorry I kept you late. Way late. Yes.
I'm wondering, just a question. I'm wondering if you know how much the leases were when they, how long they could lease their land.
The Irish settlers.
Yeah.
It's in my Gillan book. The numbers are there. And they made 3 payments a year, and they could make 1 payment in crops and stuff like that too. But does anybody know? The £5 sounds sort of familiar, but I'm not sure.
I was wondering more about the time frame. Like my ancestors leased from the Fannies, and they had a 99-year lease.
This one was 999 years too, the
Okay,
Gillan
yes.
one, yeah. And that was the good part about it,
Yeah.
because you could pass the lease on, as long as you didn't. Keeping the rent payments up was brutal, because they had no money in those early years, and they got behind. So that's why they lived in fear of eviction.
It seems like in some places on the island, they didn't get that rental lease. Like, I think that was one of the problems down in Belfast.
Yeah, I read about one area that didn't, but that was offside. For the most part, it was 999-year leases, yeah.
It's not, and then you had a few 99, and then in Belfast.
Yes, that's where I read it in your book.
Yeah, in Belfast, 1841, they started with.
And that was Douse, right?
That was Douse.
Yeah, and he wasn't.
And there was a few others, but it was Douse and Selkirk who were.
Yeah.
I'm just going to interrupt for a second here. I know there's lots of questions. I also know there might be some people who have to slip out, might have childcare or other obligations, so if you do need to leave, feel free to slip out, but we will take questions, and there's a special surprise later on.
Did they ever find out what the mechanical fault in the plane?
It wasn't a mechanical fault. That's the worst part. It was pilot error. Dad, I had occasion to, in my consulting job, of interviewing a guy who flew a 2-seater at Sutton Park, and he ran the airport there. And I told him about Dad, and the first words out of his mouth were, he said, "How many landings did he do?" I said, "A whole lot. We were all up with him that day."
Talk a little louder.
We were all up with him that day. So he had made, I don't know how many landings he would have made, 10 or 12. And the guy said to me, he said, "I don't make any more than 2 landings because you think you know the wind." And he said, "Your mind plays tricks on you. And, if your wind comes up, you don't have any gauges, of course." And so Dad liked to he was a bit of, how do I say, he liked the thrill of flying, okay? So, in the inquest, he came in all over the airport and did a quick climb. And you're not supposed to do a climb unless you're up 2,000 feet, because if you hit a stall and you're up 2,000 feet, an engine stall doesn't mean the engine stops, it means you lose lift. And so he was down, so that he was doing, I think the wind came up a little bit more in the nose, and went into an air stall, and the nose is just the engine, the only thing in the front. This thing is as light as anything, and then it goes straight down. He didn't have enough airspace to take it out of. So he would have been hitting the throttle to get speed when he hit the ground.
Frank,
You had a comment.
I just wanted to give you some context. So, sometime in the early 1980s, my aunt Margie and her husband Michael moved out to Pisket, and they became friends. Margie in particular became very good friends with Emmett Brazel, who referred to himself as Emmett Brazil. And I had the fortune of being out at Margie and Mike's one time, and neither Mike I think was on the ship, and Margie was away playing somewhere. Up came to the side of the house this little Volkswagen Rabbit, which Emmett Brazil drove, and he was a great friend of my aunt's. And he came in, and I was there by myself, and it was in May, and he said, well, what are you up to? And I said, well, not too much, tomorrow's my birthday. He said, really? He said, tomorrow's your birthday. I said, yes, I was born on May 17th, 1972. I would have been about 12 or 13. And he said, well, he said, it's a very, very difficult day for me. And he went on to tell me as much as he could of the story. I carried it with me for many years because I thought it was ahead of my head that it was a secret. I went on about 5 years later to be taught by somebody who became a hero of mine. That's your brother, Chester. And I always held Joe, as I was in my early adulthood, and you, in very, very high reverence, because I viewed your situation somewhat similar to my own, in the sense that my father wasn't dead, but my father was hospitalized for most of my life. So I felt a kinship with you through that. And you also were an inspiration for me, all of you, to be successful because of what you went through. So that was the context.
If there's no other last questions, we'll take one more, and then we have, Tony's going to come up for a special surprise.
I was just wondering, when you were talking about the McCarthys being quite well off, I did some history on some of the McCarthys that are our ancestry, and when I went to Ireland, they had owned Blarney Castle, was owned by the McCarthy family. So I'm wondering, have you traced back?
No castles in my family. But if you go back far enough, I mean, if you go back prior to the British takeover of Ireland, I mean, that's what it was. It was family, and there was, you know, O'Briens, and the O'Neills were huge in the south too. So, yeah. But I didn't get back that far to find castles. But I was pretty impressed with the people I found, you know. And it's interesting that you say that, you know, when my dad was killed, I remember spending time just wanting to find out more about him. And that's something when I want to talk to his friends, or I was like a sponge trying to find out information. So I think it was natural that when I started doing some research, I just had to keep going and find out, you know, well, maybe they'll shed a light a little bit on what my dad was. And in fact, they do. I mean, I'm them. You know, it's just amazing when I look back at my life and some of the things I did. Where'd that come from? That's where it came from. Yeah. Thank you, Karen. Obviously, there was sections of that I just couldn't read, and it was wonderful having a woman's voice too.
Well, this being St. Patrick's Day, I thought that as Gilman's came from. I didn't find one, but this song's called The Road to Dunmore, written by Robbie O'Connell. And Dunmore is near where the McCarthys came from, I would say, down in the south of Ireland. It's written from the point of view of the fellow who stayed in Ireland when the immigrants left the immigrants. I was walking the road to Dunmore one evening, as often I've done. My heart was as heavy as stone. I was thinking of times that are gone, when we walked arm in arm on the shore, and we watched the waves roll on the sea, never thinking that there'd come a time they'd be rolling between you and me. Now it's many a tide now has turned since I stood all alone on the quay, and I watched as you waved your farewells, but you left a heartbreak in me. And if I was a prince or a king, had money and treasure in store, I'd travel the whole world wide and not rest till I'd find you once more. It's many a morning I'd wait for the letters you promised to send, and I counted the hours of each day till we'd be united again. And they say that in time love grows cold, and it fades like the morning dew. But time will not alter my mind, for I know that I'll ne'er forget you. I have money enough for one glass, but maybe my credit will hold. For in memories I'm rich as a king, but they can't warm a heart that's grown cold. So I'll drink of the days that are gone, and the days that we walked on the shore. And to you I will raise up my glass, for I know that I'll ne'er see you more.
Thank you so much for coming out. I hope you get home safely, and maybe we'll see you on the 21st. We have a talk. Our last Island Lecture Series will be April 21st here in this room about the COVID islands that got created during the pandemic, thinking about the Atlantic bubble. That's Andrew Halliday. Get home safe and happy St. Patrick's Day. Thanks for coming.